Dear cops of Reddit, have you ever made an arrest you felt bad for? I knew someone in school, I'll call him Steve, who got arrested for beating down his mother's boyfriend at the time. The guy was forcing Steve's mother onto H and made her sell for him at one point, and one day Steve walked into his mother's room to the guy choking her out for talking back at him. Steve kicked the living crap out of him, but his own mother called the police and pressed charges against her son because she was so afraid of her boyfriend. The officers that responded knew Steve's situation but had to follow the call. I spoke to him at length about this not too long ago, and he said that all the officers treated him with respect and we're outwardly apologetic for having to arrest him. I think the charges were dropped, thankfully. Steve told me the last he heard of his mother's now ex-boyfriend is that someone burned his face with petrol and he's totally disfigured now. His mother is with another guy who's helping her start an antique shop apparently, so smiles all around. Steve told me the last he heard of his mother's now ex-boyfriend is that someone burned his face with petrol and he's totally disfigured now. Someone. Don't frick with Steve. Not me. My mom. She was working Vice as an undercover prostitute. This lonely guy drove up to her corner. It was the poor guy's birthday and he didn't want to spend it alone. She kept trying to talk him out of it and told him to go home. The guy wouldn't take no for an answer. I did street outreach to prostitutes for 8 years. The undercover Vice women were the easiest to spot, although in fairness I had more of an eye for what the women looked like than most. That said, haircuts and general appearance hygiene usually gave it away, so they were more likely to pick up men who were very green when it came to buying services. I was a military police officer. A couple had driven up to the gate around midnight, a young private, his wife and 2 kids. They had been transferred to the base I was assigned to, so they had to be exhausted from driving all day. The gate guards found guns in their glove box and door panel. Not too surprising, a ton of soldiers own firearms. However, they failed to declare them at the gate and they were loaded with a round in the chamber. Guns are kinda useless otherwise. This was called over the radio and I was dispatched. The wife claimed ownership of the firearms. I wasn't sure, but I think she did so her husband didn't have to deal with command. I had no choice but to arrest her. I really didn't want to. I knew they were not there to shoot the place up or anything, just traveling. But since it was over the radio and everyone knew about it, I had to make the arrest. She was crying hard and was terrified of her kids seeing her be arrested. So told her to wait and went to the kids, who were no older than 8. I told them I needed to take their mom for a while to process her into the base. They said okay and thanked me. I then pulled my patrol car around the building. Protocol was to cuff her and transport her to the jail. Instead I explained I knew what happened, apologized and said I would not cuff her. I drove her to the jail. When there I explained everything to my supervisor. I also wrote a memo for the judge explaining everything so the charges would be dropped. Were they dropped? There are a few. 2 really stick in my mind. The first was an elderly female who I arrested for a warrant, passing bad checks. She had found her husband deceased lying on the living room floor. I logged her name for the report later and lo and behold up pops this felony warrant for passing a bad check a few years prior. She had 0 contact with the law so it was never taken care of. I tried to let her slide but my SGT made me hook her. I was brand new and still on probation so I did what I was ordered to do. Worst transport up to the jail I've had in 8 years. What made it worse was how understanding she was. Second one wasn't an arrest, but a child custody placement. Cole was originally a child custody agreement violation. Mother was refusing to hand her infant child over to the father. We get there and female is distraught, completely hysterical. Father shows us court-ordered custody papers for the child granting him full custody. Turns out father is a complete butt, abusive towards mother to include threatening her with a gun. He ends up leaving her for his young mistress. Well, he had been so controlling over the mother he never allowed her to work. So when he left she was basically destitute. Father can afford high-priced attorney and easily wins full custody as mother is representing herself. Having to physically remove the infant from the mother's arms and hand him over to the complete scumbag of a father really had me questioning my career choice for a long time. Having to physically remove the infant from the mother's arms and hand him over to the complete scumbag of a father really had me questioning my career choice for a long time. At least you know your moral compass is not broken. But dang, that is not a nice situation to find yourself in. My dad had to arrest an underage prostitute who had no family and was abused as a lot by the underworld. She went to a youth penitentiary of some sorts and he had control over her file and also was on the case to arrest the prostitute importers. We're from Belgium, we have a lot of East European pimp lords importing and abuse underage East European girls. After she was free, a couple of hours later she committed suicide. He told me she was an orphan and there are apparently orphanages in those countries that sell the girls for 2k to 3k euros. My dad is doing his job but I can tell he feels really terrible when he deals with stuff like these. It is especially difficult when he has a daughter about the same age of the underage prostitutes. It is a mad world. That is beyond fricked up that a girl can be arrested for being kidnapped and sold as a rape slave. I worked in a group home. We had a gentleman who lived there who had a developmental disability and was very impulsive. On occasion he would leave the home and go down to the corner convenience store. He had no concept of money, so he would take a candy bar or a soda and leave without paying. The store knew us and would call us and we would walk down and pay. One day, the store got a new manager. This butthole decides that he is going to press charges against the guy. So he calls the police and has him arrested. They fingerprint him and everything. This guy has no idea what is going on and he now has a criminal record. The police felt terrible about it and were not shy with sharing that with me. My staff and I never walked into that store again. I was in court for a speeding ticket and there was a known mentally challenged man with hearing loss. He was cited for disturbing the peace or something like that. The poor guy is up there trying to tell the judge what happened and fight the ticket. He even has a friend, neighbor, family member there to explain that he can't control the volume of his voice because he is deaf. The deaf man is being very loud and moving around a lot and the judge eventually tells him basically that he needs to stay in his house all day instead of being out in public where people can hear him being loud. I think he got a disorderly conduct ticket too. I once arrested a deaf woman who decided to steal a couple purses that were valued at thousands of dollars apiece. She told me her story on the way to jail and I just wanted to open the door and let her go. Basically her son had just died in a tragic accident and her husband died recently as well. She said she saw the purses in a commercial and thought they would make her feel better. Once we got to jail there is a printed warning on the Sally Port door that tells all the incoming inmates that any type of sexual activities and rape is strictly prohibited. She looked at the sign and looked at me and said, with tears in her eyes and that deaf person sounding speech, "That's not going to happen to me, is it? That is one of many. I really hate bringing good people to jail. We all make mistakes." I dunno. It kinda sounds like she was just saying that to make you feel sorry for her. If she was telling the truth, that's too bad, but it sounds a bit sketchy. I have a question. Do cops have a good reason for issuing DWIs for people who are sleeping in the passenger seat of the car, or are otherwise showing reasonable doubt that they do not intend to drive? This has happened to a lot of people I know, and I've had to rely on sleeping in my car plenty of times after drinking. I put my keys inside the gas cap door that could only be opened from the inside, and prayed that it was enough to keep me out of trouble. I know the whole quota thing is more or less a myth. But what is the reasoning for DWIs in those conditions? I asked an officer about quotas when I was younger and she was doing a presentation to my elementary school class. Her reply was something like, "There aren't any quotas, but if you're not giving men tickets you may not have a job for long." I'm not a cop, but when I got arrested for stealing alcohol I met a cop who had a great sense of humor and was possibly trying to lighten the mood. I don't know if he felt sorry for me or not, because I was obviously scared, but I really appreciated it, because I still laugh at it. I was handcuffed to a rail on the wall of this room, as I waited to be processed. He was just passing through and asked me and the guy being detained across from me what we did. He was also there for retail theft, but stole a bunch of gains. When I told him I was there for stealing alcohol, he looked down at my shoes, which were a pair of beat up Chucks, and said, "Man, you should have tried to steal a new pair of shoes, because those are fricked up." I couldn't help but laugh and the other guy did too, as the cop walked away. I was on the receiving end of this arrest, but I know the officer felt bad about it because he said so. It was back in high school. 4 friends and I were out at night goofing off in our suburb when we decided to prank a girl we knew. She had been our friend until we found out that she was spreading nasty rumors about each of us, as well as some of our other friends. In my case, she had told the best friend of a girl that I had almost managed to make into my first girlfriend that all I wanted was a BJ. I would have been happy for a girl to hold my hand, but whatever, so we went to her house and found a recycling bin full of newspapers, as well as an old sack lunch, and decided that it was all we needed. So we put the dry newspapers all over her car until it was nearly covered, and I put some apple slices that were left in the bag on her car as well. Thinking we got away with it, we scampered off into the night. Well, turns out we weren't so lucky. The girl had called the cops and wanted to press charges. So the next day at school, my friends and I received the dark red office notes and went in to face the music. When I got to the office, they sent me back to the principal and he had a cop with him. The first thing the cop said to me was, "I really wish that I didn't have to do this because it is incredibly stupid, but I have to place you under arrest." Turns out I was guilty of criminal mischief 3. Thankfully, my diversion counselor said that I just needed better things to do with my time. So I went and watched What the Bleep Do We Know, told him about it, and poof, it was gone from my record. Sheriff Inton here. I was part of a third shift ride along 2300-0700 ride along on Valentine's Day. It was about 11:30 p.m. 2330, and we ran a plate that showed an expired license. We pulled over the SUV. The license that came back was registered to a woman. That woman was the passenger of the vehicle. Also, showed that she was pregnant. The driver of an SUV was an African American man who was dressed super fly. I mean Argyle sweater, matching Nikes, dress pants, etc. He was on probation for something. I don't exactly remember. He had not been drinking, smoking, speeding. He was doing nothing wrong. We simply ran plates on the basis of reasonable suspicion, which is perfectly legal. But the driver was on probation. We called up his parole officer and they called a hold on him. Arrest him. It is Valentine's Day. This guy was doing nothing wrong. Probably driving back to get some. And we are arresting him. Should also add Valentine's Day was on a Friday this year. This means he was not released until Monday morning. Felt really bad for the guy. I'm not a cop, but I have a huge respect for them. My dad had just passed away from cancer, and a few nights after I had no idea what to do with myself. Being in the weakest frame of mind, I went out late at night and got high downtown, by myself, at a park that I had gone to a few times before to get away from life. I relapsed that night from being 2 years sober. The last thing I remember is being handcuffed and sitting in the back of a squad car. When I started to regain my senses, I was on a dissociative drug. I totally broke down in tears. I had worked so hard to get clean, and was so beat from taking care of my dad through his illness that I had reached rock bottom. I started to talk to the cops about my life, and they listened. They listened for a good long while. They ended up driving me around the city for a good 2-3 hours while I told them about my life, my family problems, how I was doing in school, my dad's illness. These two cops were amazing people, and they realized I wasn't the criminal they thought they had picked up. They took me to McDonald's drive-thru and then drove me home. I wasn't charged. That was the worst time of my life, and it could have been a lot worse if those cops weren't so understanding. I am so grateful. I usually say frick my command, and only make arrests I feel comfortable making. The few I have felt bad about were when I first came on, and I was pressured to get my numbers up. Mostly they were for driving on suspended licenses, which is a stupid thing to get locked up for. Most of my arrests are for domestic violence, cause I don't play with that crap. Good buddy of mine is a new cop. His very first arrest was a 19-YO, public intoxication. The kid just got out of a mental institution 3 days before for a suicide attempt. He felt pretty bad. It may not help your buddy to know, but it may. Alcohol is a factor at 60% of all suicides, roughly. Getting that kid sober and maybe some help on a misdemeanor charge that won't screw him forever may have saved his life. It at least stopped a depressed drunk from wandering around where he had the means to hurt himself and lowered inhibitions to stop him. A friend told me a story of how his superior officer once made him arrest a drunk man for practically no reason. The man was just walking down the street on his way home from the bar. He wasn't bothering anyone and was just trying to get him. My buddy decided to see what he was up to and then let him be. Soon after, my buddy's superior officer showed up and told him his tickets arrests for the month were low. It was a new quota ticket system that my friend really didn't agree with. His superior told him to turn around and arrest ticket the man. So he did. He said he feels really bad about it and regrets it. My friend ended quitting after that. He just realized that's not what protecting and serving is all about. I hear he's still fighting to reverse the ticket counter system through the courts. TLDR. My friend ticketed a drunk guy and quit his job. Was forced to arrest a grandma. Despite my legal argument and moral standpoint, who had been tormented by her white trash neighbors for months. She slapped their kid out of instinct when he called her an old C out the front of her home. They were just the worst freaking pieces of trash I've ever met. There was a shoplifting at Walmart in my city about a year or two ago, where it was the guy and his girlfriend that did it. He was entering his 40s and she was in her early 20s but suffered from it after a tractor ran over her head when she was younger. Her developmental and cognitive skills were affected by it and she has the brain capacity of an 8-year-old. Her parents' words, not mine. Anyway, the boyfriend was really manipulative and used the fact that she was challenged to his advantage. He lied to her, told her his name was Gary when in actuality it was David. Actual names redacted. Somehow, someway, he talked her into going with him while he steals some stuff from Walmart, and then when they were initially confronted about it by a store rep, they ran for it. They got in their piece of crap truck and took off. One of our officers spotted them right as the call went through, so he was able to maintain visual contact with them and pursue. The gut started driving all through the streets trying to lose our guys, but it was apparent he didn't know the city that well. He would take dead ends and hop the curb, take streets that led right back to where we had already been. He even made it out of our city twice, into 2 separate cities, and came right on back. He finally took a curb too fast and blew out a couple of his tires. He ended up coming to a stop in a big open field, behind the Walmart he just stole from. By this time, not only did we have a number of officers on this pursuit, we had the neighboring city, the sheriff's department, and even a state trooper. Guns are drawn and they go to make contact with the driver. His window gets broken. He puts up a struggle, and officer uses his taser. That's when the girlfriend catches her charge. She breaks the lead of one of the prongs STCK in this guy, so the taser is ineffective temporarily. After our officers grab this guy and start pulling him out, she grabs on and starts oppling. About that time, another officer is breaking out her window and pulling her out by the hair. It's not until about 2 hours later that it sinks in that this girl is mentally handicapped and she is catching a felony along with her dong bag of a boyfriend. It all comes out later on when we are asking him his name and job that we get skeptical about that info and decide to identify him by fingerprint. We find out his real name and that he has felony warrants from neighboring states. It was a catastrophe to her. She was furious and saddened at the same time that he would lie, and continue to lie, to her about something so small like your name. She just didn't know how to handle this, and didn't think she did anything wrong because he kept lying to her and telling her she was doing right. Dang. Sad story for her. Some years ago, I was driving through an alley with my partner when suddenly we saw women get raped. As soon as the rapist saw us, he started running while being armed and the weapon somehow dropped on the ground from his hands or pants. Anyways, the woman immediately picked up the weapon and shot the rapist in the back I think 5 times before we were even able to see that there was a weapon on the ground or in her hand. After she had taken the shot, she tossed the weapon and started crying. We knew we had to arrest her. To tell you the truth, it even crossed our minds to create a different scene where the woman was not involved at all. We ended up arresting her and I still regret that arrest. I had to arrest an indigenous person for trespassing in a residential lobby, refusing to move and then assaulting a peace officer. The thing was, it was in the middle of winter and he was homeless. He had only a t-shirt and thin jacket on top, a pair of tattered jeans as bottoms, and really old and wet looking running shoes. Thinking back, I didn't want to perform any type of eviction in the first place, but my sergeant thought otherwise and wanted to see what I could do. So, I used verbal commands and when unsuccessful, shook him awake. He woke up but would not follow direction. I looked at my sergeant and he just gave me the go on with it look. So, being a rookie, I did as I was silently commanded. When trying to get the person on his feet, I noticed the strong smell of Listerine or mouthwash. He then spat at me, his mucus landing on my radio mouthpiece on my shoulder. I immediately put him down, cuffed him and sadly broke one of his fingers in the process. He howled with pain. This arrest lingered with me for a long time. I remember feeling sick to my stomach and incredibly torn about my career choice immediately after. This was somebody's son, maybe someone's brother or father. All he really wanted was a warm place to sleep. Never again did I evict anyone who needed a place to sleep during a cold night. I feel so lucky now to have chosen to move on from law enforcement and into education. I was Leo for almost 10 years. I worked on the ERT, SWAT, and held many specialized posts. However, I can truly say that no career has been more satisfying to me than being able to teach young minds and provide social and emotional care for a living. No longer would I have to enforce arbitrary rules that I do not want to enforce. No longer will I be stigmatized as a mindless brute. There are amazing officers out there, but it is the few that give the rest of the professionals a bad name. I'm a probation officer, rather than a cop. But can I join in, as I have one story that to this day makes me a little bit sad and angry with the criminal justice system. So this guy was at the mall with his girlfriend, on a high up floor with a balcony. Suddenly a fight broke out between two groups of guys. Security rushes in to break it up, and even though they were not part of the fight, one of the guards grabs the guy's partner, shoves her right up to the railings. It's about a 50-foot drop, and starts twisting her arm so that she ends up hanging over the bars from her hips, trying to not have her arm broken. Young boyfriend sees this and flips, heads the girl he loves screaming in pain. He ran over and tore the security guard off her, and proceeds to beat on him unconscious. Young man was charged with assault. His lawyer was good and managed to get it down from a section 18, which would have brought jail time. Instead of going to jail, he got a 2-year probation order, with some courses thrown in there. He was one of the nicest, innocent-est young men I've ever worked with, and never should have been in trouble. Wrong place, wrong time, I guess. But I was so glad when I could sign him off. 'Cause every time I had a meeting with him I could only think I probably would have done everything exactly the same as him. Similar to someone in this thread, my mother was also an undercover prostitute. She had a lonely old man come up to her and start talking to her, asking how much, and my mother kept trying to get him to leave. He eventually told her that he is lonely and will pay anything to feel the love of a woman again. She couldn't do it, and told him to really go away, like dropped every hint ever that she was a cop. He finally got the hint and left. She has a ton of stories where she does it for people that aren't criminals per se, but just people that got the short end of the crappy stick. Anyway, this was only sort of relevant, but she never arrested him. I never got the point of prostitution being illegal, and especially not at arresting users rather than suppliers. I'm not a cop, but I have 2 experiences in my past that make me very thankful for the good kind of cops. I was 14 and my life was pretty bad. I ran away from the home I was in, was kicked out of my mother's house because my new stepdad didn't like me. I made it all the way across several states with my boyfriend in a stolen car. My grandfather was probably the only person to really care about me, and since he was a private investigator, and a really good one, he had me found in less than 3 days. We were busted at a grocery store trying to buy food. The cop that arrested me was incredibly kind. I was crying, and not because I was arrested but because I had to go back home. I was willing to live on the street at 14 than to go back to the home I was in. It was a ways to go in the cop car to the juvenile center, so he turned up some rock music and jammed out with me to make me feel better. It seems like such a small thing, but when you're 14 and suffering, it was his kindness that helped get me through. The staff at the juvenile center provided me food, shelter, and a psychiatrist to help me. They were also nice, and vouched for me to get to go home with my grandpa instead of the harsh home I was in before. The second time, I was about 16. I was behaving well. I had my own car, got my license, and was going to a concert with my brother. The concert was in a big city and I never drove on a highway before. I was scared, so my brother, who was 21, drove for me. He had his license suspended, and he made a left turn and didn't yield properly at a light. Because we were from such a small town, we'd never encountered lights that weren't protected left turns. We got pulled over, and instead of the cop arresting us for him having his license suspended, he told me to get into the driver's seat and to deal with the scary roads myself. He was sympathetic to the fact that I was nervous and had my brother drive for me. I think it was cause I was wearing kitty cat ears for the concert and overalls that made me look young. This was back in 2000, when this was cute rave attire. I had to drive all the way home on the highway that night. It was the first time I ever did that, but it was far less scary than my brother going to jail. I had an extremely rough youth, but thankfully, the people in charge have always been there for me. I have a few other instances where they helped me in places when I'd have probably died, like when I overdosed on drugs at 17. I'm 29 now, married with kids, and haven't touched a drug or gotten into any trouble since then. If it wasn't for the good cops, psychiatrists and doctors that helped me, I could have ended up on a different path with a huge criminal records. I was arrested yesterday and was bailed out 2 hours ago, and the officer that arrested me clearly felt bad for me because I didn't do anything. This is what happened. I had to pay a bill, and because I don't have a credit card, my option was to pay through MoneyGram or get one of those prepaid cards. I got a prepaid card from Walmart. It was an American Express Bluebird card. When I called the company to pay my bill, they told me that they don't take American Express. So I thought, no big deal. I'll just stop by a CVS and pay my bill with MoneyGram using the card I had purchased. This was my first time ever using MoneyGram, so I informed the cashier lady that I needed a MoneyGram, and I gave her all of the information. As she was pushing it into the cash register, she accidentally completed the transaction before I even paid. So she asked for the total. It was about $102, and I handed her my prepaid card and some cash to cover the cost of the MoneyGram. She told me that MoneyGram only accepts cash. I didn't care of that beforehand because I had never used MoneyGram before. I did not have enough cash to cover the cost since I used whatever cash I had for the prepaid card and my remaining cash was at home. I asked her to cancel the transaction, but she said that she can't, and I explained to her that J don't have enough. She called MoneyGram and they said that I can't leave without paying the full amount. I was like, WTF. All of this happened because the cashier hit the complete button or whatever it is on the register. I kept telling her I didn't have enough, so she called the cops. They came and were informed of the situation, locked me up and took me jail until the payment was paid. I was clearly not at fault, but I'm guessing they locked me up so that the cashier would not get into any trouble with MoneyGram or CVS corporate. My dad ended up paying the balance for CVS and bailing me out. As the officer handcuffed me and put me into his car, it was clear that he didn't want to do this because it was clearly a mistake on the cashier's end, but he had to because it was his job. Whatever though, it all worked out in the end. I arrested a guy at 2 AM on Christmas morning in front of his family. I tried everything not to, but he had alcohol butthole syndrome and was waking up the neighbors. To give an idea of how big and butthole he was being, his family apologized to me for him forcing me to arrest him. I still felt like kind of a dong for doing it though. Working the late shift a dozen years ago, one of my co-workers told me a few stories about his and his father's experiences as state police officers. This is my favorite, since neither of them have heard of Reddit, when a prominent, but notoriously shady local businessman went missing and a routine investigation went nowhere. The state police sent an undercover officer, my co-worker's father, to investigate. This guy had a lot of experience posing as criminals in jails, to elicit confessions, and arranging elaborate cons to trick people into confessions. He did some investigating and quickly honed in on this guy's petite little wife. He posed as a criminal looking for a payment of a debt from her husband and began coming around, pressing her for answers about her husband's disappearance. It took him months of visits to build some trust, but still she did not reveal anything about her husband's disappearance. She did talk often of the pressure that the district attorney had been placing on her though. Finally he came up with an extremely elaborate con. He arranged for a pregnant female judicial employee along with the district attorney to stage a meeting at a seedy local hotel for the undercover officer and the wife to witness. The officer had convinced the wife that the district attorney had impregnated an employee and he was there to record their encounter in order to blackmail him. She believed him and finally trusted him enough to reveal what happened. Her husband had been abusing her for years and she had enough. They lived in a rural area. She spent weeks digging up an old stump in the front yard. One evening, when her husband came home and sat on the edge of the bed to remove his boots, bam, double barrel to the chest, he had not noticed that she had placed a plastic tarp under the comforter. What she did to move the body was classic. She tied up his body in the comforter with the plastic tarp and ran the rope out to the tow hitch on her pickup. She drove extremely slowly, dragging the body through the house, out the door and across the yard. If the body got stuck on the wall or a corner, she would go in and physically do what she could to move it. Eventually she got it out to the old stump in the yard, used the truck the stump to one side, and dumped the body underneath. He arrested her of course, but felt so bad that he testified on her behalf and was instrumental in getting her a very much reduced sentence. Yes, girl with Ms. had a warrant. She called saying she couldn't get up. Supervisor made us do our jobs even though it was for court fines. Such bulls. I feel like cops have tons of these. They're just following orders. Yeah, some people forget that cops don't make laws. I've been reading about police departments starting to equip all officers with cameras. To the cops out there, will this remove your ability to use discretion and force you to make arrests even if you feel like they are unnecessary? If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.